Montana Territory, 1877. The winter came early that year, sweeping across the foothills of the Absaroka Range with a vengeance that caught even the most weather-hardened frontiersmen by surprise. Isaac Vance stood at the edge of the cattle pens, watching his breath cloud in the frigid air as he wrestled with the same thought that had plagued him since his arrival in Paradise Valley 3 years prior. The frontier was no place for anything tender to survive. At 25, Isaac had already seen enough death to last several lifetimes. The Civil War had claimed his father and older brother, and the unforgiving Montana winters had taken two of his closest ranch hands last year. He'd built walls around his heart as sturdy as the log cabin he'd constructed with his own hands, determined that survival required solitude. Attachments only made a man vulnerable, and vulnerability got men killed in this untamed country. "Cattle ain't looking good," remarked Salas, the grizzled foreman who'd been with him since Isaac had purchased the struggling Double V ranch. "They never do before the first big snow," Isaac replied, adjusting his Stetson against the biting wind. His lean frame was already tensed against the coming storm, shoulders squared beneath his sheepskin coat. Despite his youth, the other ranchers in the valley respected him. A man who could break the wildest Mustang, shoot straight in a fight, and work from sunrise to sunset without complaint had earned his place among them. "Town meeting tomorrow about the railroad coming through," Silas continued. "Might want to attend, see how it affects our water rights." Isaac nodded, his gray eyes scanning the darkening horizon. What he wanted was simple: to make his ranch prosper, to prove that he could tame this slice of wild country. What he told no one, not even Silas, was how the loneliness sometimes ate at him in the dead of night, when the howling of wolves echoed the emptiness inside him. Paradise Valley might have been aptly named for its stunning vistas, but Isaac had long concluded that paradise wasn't meant for him. The following morning, Isaac rode into the growing settlement of Livingston. The town had sprouted alongside the Yellowstone River almost overnight when news of the Northern Pacific Railroad's planned route reached the territory. What had been little more than a trading post now boasted a proper general store, 2 saloons, a small church, and to Isaac's surprise, a new photography studio with a sign reading "Kelsey Portraits and Art Supplies" hanging above the door. As he tethered his horse outside the meeting hall, a commotion near the stagecoach stop caught his attention. A young woman was arguing with the driver, who seemed to be shaking his head apologetically while gesturing to her numerous trunks and cases. "Sir, I assure you I was told accommodations would be arranged." Her voice carried across the muddy street, refined in a way that immediately marked her as an Easterner. Isaac might have continued on his way, other people's troubles weren't his concern, but something about her stopped him. Perhaps it was the determined set of her shoulders despite her obvious distress, or the way she stood her ground against the burly stagecoach driver without flinching. He approached slowly, taking in her appearance. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool, practical yet undeniably elegant, with a matching coat and hat. Her honey blonde hair was partially visible, arranged in a style that spoke of Eastern fashion. She couldn't have been more than 20, and despite her evident frustration, there was something vibrant about her that seemed to brighten the drab winter morning. "Problem, ma'am?" Isaac asked, tipping his hat. She turned, revealing a face that caused Isaac's carefully maintained composure to falter. Her eyes were the clear blue of mountain lakes in summer, her complexion fair but with a natural blush heightened by the cold. She was beautiful in a way that felt almost out of place in this rough frontier town, like finding a wildflower blooming in snow. "This gentleman informs me that my accommodations have fallen through," she said, her voice steadier now. "Apparently Mrs. Wilkins, who was to board me, fell ill and has gone to stay with her daughter in Bozeman. Hannah Kelsey," she added, extending a gloved hand with unexpected directness. "I've come to open the photography studio. My equipment and supplies are in these trunks, and I find myself without a roof over my head on the edge of what appears to be a significant snowstorm." Isaac hesitated before taking her hand. In that brief moment, a dozen thoughts raced through his mind, most prominently that this young woman with her city manners and delicate appearance would never survive a Montana winter. The frontier chewed up far hardier souls every year. "Isaac Vance," he replied, "owner of the Double V Ranch outside town." "Mr. Vance," the stagecoach driver interrupted, "you heading to the town meeting? Maybe you could help Miss Kelsey find some accommodations." "I've got a schedule to keep." Isaac found himself nodding before he'd fully considered the implications. The boarding house might have space, he offered, though he doubted it. The railroad surveyors had filled every available room for miles. "I've already inquired," Hannah replied. "Nothing available until spring." Isaac shifted uncomfortably, aware that the gathering snow clouds wouldn't wait for this woman's problems to be solved. The temperature was dropping rapidly and nightfall would bring dangerous cold. "There's a small cabin on my property," he heard himself saying. "Used to be the original homestead before I built the main house. It's simple but sound. You could stay there until something opens up in town." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. Isaac Vance didn't invite strangers into his life. He certainly didn't offer shelter to beautiful young women who had no business being in Montana territory in the first place. Hannah studied him intently, as if measuring his character in that single glance. "That's very kind, Mr. Vance, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not kindness, ma'am," he replied truthfully, "just common sense. Storm's coming, and nobody survives their first Montana blizzard without shelter." What Isaac didn't say was that he'd put her up in the cabin, help her realize how unsuitable the frontier was for someone like her, and soon enough she'd be on the next stagecoach back east where she belonged. The territory had a way of testing newcomers, and most failed that test quickly enough. After the town meeting, where heated debates about the railroad's impact divided the room between those who saw progress and those who feared change, Isaac found himself loading Hannah's trunks onto his wagon. She sat beside him on the buckboard, her posture straight despite the cold, occasionally asking questions about the landscape that he answered with minimal words. "You don't believe I'll last the winter," she said suddenly as they passed the last outskirts of town. Isaac glanced at her, surprised by her directness. "Most don't," he replied honestly. "I'm not most people, Mr. Vance," she said, her breath forming delicate clouds in the air. "My father was a photographer who documented the war. I assisted him from the age of 14. I've developed plates in field tents during battles and hauled equipment through Virginia swamps. Montana may be colder, but I suspect it's no more challenging than what I've already survived." Something in her tone made Isaac look at her more carefully. Behind the refined appearance was a steel he hadn't initially recognized, something familiar that resonated with his own determination. "We'll see," was all he said, but he found himself wondering if perhaps he'd misjudged Hannah Kelsey. The first snowflakes began to fall as they reached the double V. Isaac settled Hannah in the cabin, which was indeed simple, one room with a small stove, a bed, table, and chair, but solid and weather-tight. He showed her how to bank the fire to last through the night and promised to check on her in the morning. As he walked back to his own house through the thickening snow, Isaac told himself he'd done his Christian duty, nothing more. Come spring, she'd be gone and his life would continue as it had before, solitary but secure, free from the complications that attachments brought. What he couldn't explain was why, for the first time in years, his house felt emptier than usual when he entered it alone. The storm lasted 3 days, dropping nearly 2 feet of snow across Paradise Valley. Isaac checked on Hannah each morning and evening, bringing supplies and ensuring her fire remained lit. To his surprise, she seemed to be adapting quickly, learning to manage the stove and even venturing out to collect additional firewood from the pile he'd stacked beside her cabin. On the 4th day, when the sun finally broke through, Hannah announced her intention to go to town to begin setting up her studio. "Roads won't be passable for another day at least," Isaac informed her over coffee at his kitchen table, where he'd invited her for breakfast. "Then perhaps you might show me around your ranch," she suggested. "I'd like to take some photographs while the snow is fresh. Montana landscapes would sell well back east." Isaac had work to do, cattle to check, fences to repair, but found himself agreeing. Something about Hannah's enthusiasm was difficult to refuse, and he told himself it was merely curiosity about her photography equipment that prompted his interest. They spent the morning with Hannah setting up her camera at various points around the property. Isaac was impressed despite himself by the efficient way she handled the complicated apparatus, setting up tripods in the snow and disappearing beneath the black cloth to compose her shots. "Would you mind standing with your horse by that fence line?" she asked, pointing to a spot where the snow-covered pasture met the distant mountains. "The human element gives scale to the landscape." Reluctantly, Isaac complied, feeling foolish as he stood holding his horse's reins while she ducked under the camera cloth again. "Perfect," she murmured. "The light on your face is exactly right." Later, as they returned to the ranch house, Hannah surprised him by pulling a small leather-bound book from her coat pocket. "I sketch compositions before I photograph them," she explained. "It helps me visualize the final image. I'd like to show you some of my ideas for the studio." She handed him the sketchbook and Isaac flipped it open, expecting to see landscapes. Instead, he found page after page of portraits, faces captured with remarkable skill and sensitivity. He turned another page and stopped, stunned by what he saw. It was his own face looking back at him. Not from today's photography session, but from what must have been his first encounter with Hannah in town. She had captured him in the moment he'd approached her by the stagecoach, his expression serious yet somehow gentle, a half-smile just beginning to form as he tipped his hat. "When did you draw this?" he asked, his voice unnaturally rough. Hannah looked embarrassed. "That evening in the cabin. I often sketch from memory to practice." She hesitated. "You have a remarkable face, Mr. Vance, strong but kind. It's the sort of face that tells a story." Isaac stared at the drawing, disturbed by how she had seen something in him that he barely recognized in himself anymore, a softness he thought he'd buried years ago. He closed the book and handed it back without comment. That night, alone in his house, Isaac found himself thinking about Hannah's sketch. The man she had drawn wasn't the hardened rancher he believed himself to be. She had seen something else, something he'd been denying existed. The realization unsettled him deeply. Over the next 2 weeks, as the roads gradually cleared, Isaac helped Hannah transport her equipment to town and set up her studio. He told himself it was merely neighborly, that anyone would help a newcomer get established. But the truth was, he found himself inventing reasons to visit Livingston more frequently than usual. Hannah's studio quickly became a topic of conversation throughout the valley. She had a gift not just for taking photographs but for putting her subjects at ease. Miners, ranchers, and townspeople who would normally avoid such fancy business found themselves sitting for portraits to send back to family in the East. Isaac observed all this from a careful distance, watching as Hannah integrated herself into the community with a natural grace that belied his initial judgment of her as too delicate for frontier life. She didn't just survive. She thrived, adapting to each challenge with determination and even humor. When the pipes in her studio froze during a particularly bitter cold snap, Isaac found her thawing them with heated rocks, her sleeves rolled up and her face flushed with exertion. When the spring mud made the roads nearly impassable, she simply donned men's boots beneath her skirts and carried on with her business. "You're not what I expected," he admitted one evening in late February when he'd stopped by the studio to deliver some supplies from his latest trip to Helena. Hannah looked up from the glass plate she was preparing. "What did you expect, Mr. Vance?" "Someone who'd be gone by Christmas," he answered honestly. She laughed, the sound warming the room more effectively than the stove in the corner. "And instead, you're stuck with me until at least next winter." The thought of Hannah remaining in Livingston for another year provoked a reaction in Isaac that he wasn't prepared to examine too closely. As winter grudgingly gave way to spring, Isaac found his carefully constructed isolation crumbling. Hannah had become a regular visitor to the ranch, often riding out on a mare he'd helped her purchase to photograph the changing seasons. Sometimes she stayed for dinner, filling his usually quiet house with conversation about her latest projects or town gossip. On one such evening in early April, as they sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink, Hannah asked about his family. "Lost my father and brother at Gettysburg," he said after a long pause. "Mother passed from influenza the winter after. Came west with nothing but my father's pocket watch and a determination to build something that would last." "And you have," Hannah observed, gesturing to the prosperous ranch around them. "But you've built it alone." Isaac stared at the distant mountains. "Alone is safer," he said finally. "Out here, caring for someone is just setting yourself up for loss." Hannah was quiet for so long that Isaac thought the conversation had ended. Then she said softly, "My father used to say that a photograph captures light that would otherwise be lost to time. The image exists because light touched the plate, even if just for a moment." She turned to face him. "I think love is like that, worth capturing even if it's fleeting." The simple wisdom of her words struck him with unexpected force. Before he could respond, she stood up, brushing off her skirts. "I should head back to town before it gets too dark," she said. Isaac watched her ride away, her figure silhouetted against the sunset, and felt something shift inside him, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. May brought cattle drives and the busiest season for ranchers throughout the valley. Isaac spent long days in the saddle, moving his herds to summer pastures and negotiating contracts with the railroad's meat suppliers. He saw less of Hannah during this period, though he found himself looking for excuses to ride into town whenever possible. On one such visit in early June, he arrived at her studio to find a crowd gathered outside. A large man was shouting, his face red with anger, while Hannah stood in the doorway, her expression calm but resolute. "I paid good money for those portraits," the man was saying as Isaac approached, "and I want them today." "Mr. Donovan," Hannah replied evenly, "as I've explained, your wife asked me not to release the portraits to you, as she was the one who commissioned them." "She's my wife," Donovan bellowed. "Her property is my property, and that includes those photographs." Isaac pushed through the gathering onlookers. He recognized Donovan as a ranch owner from the north end of the valley, a man with a reputation for heavy drinking and a heavier hand with both his horses and his young wife. "Is there a problem here?" Isaac asked, positioning himself beside Hannah. Donovan's eyes narrowed. "Vance, this ain't your concern. The woman's holding property that belongs to me." "The portraits were a gift, Mrs. Donovan intended for her parents," Hannah explained to Isaac, though her eyes remained fixed on Donovan. "She specifically asked that her husband not collect them." Isaac had heard rumors about Mrs. Donovan's bruises, always carefully explained away as accidents. He'd also heard that her parents back east had been trying to persuade her to leave her husband. "Sounds like this is between Mrs. Donovan and Miss Kelsey," Isaac said carefully. "Maybe you should discuss it with your wife first." "I don't need to discuss anything with my wife," Donovan snarled, taking a threatening step forward. "I need this uppity Eastern girl to give me what's mine before I take it myself." He reached for Hannah, but Isaac moved faster, catching the man's wrist in a grip that stopped him cold. "You don't want to do that," Isaac said quietly. For a tense moment, the two men stood frozen, Donovan's wrist caught in Isaac's unrelenting grasp. Then Donovan wrenched away, his face contorted with fury. "You'll regret this, Vance," he spat. "Both of you will." He turned and stalked away, the crowd parting quickly to let him pass. "Are you all right?" Isaac asked Hannah when the onlookers had dispersed. She nodded, though he noticed her hands were trembling slightly. "I wasn't going to give him those portraits," she said. "I've seen the bruises on Elizabeth's arms. Those photographs are her ticket home to her family in Boston." "Donovan's not a man who forgets a slight," Isaac warned. "He'll make trouble for you." Hannah met his gaze steadily. "I'm not afraid of men like him. I've dealt with worse." Isaac believed her, but that didn't stop him from worrying. "I'll stay in town tonight," he decided. "Sleep in the back of your studio just in case." "That's not necessary," Hannah began. "It is," Isaac interrupted. "Trust me on this." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she didn't argue further. That night, as Isaac made a makeshift bed on the floor of her darkroom, Hannah worked late developing plates from a wedding she'd photographed the previous weekend. "Why did you really come west?" Isaac asked as he watched her work in the dim red light. Hannah was quiet for a moment, focused on the image emerging in the chemical bath. "After my father died, there wasn't much left for me in Pennsylvania," she said finally. "I worked for another photographer, but she hesitated. He had expectations that had nothing to do with my skills behind a camera." Isaac's jaw tightened. "Did he hurt you?" "He tried," Hannah replied, her voice matter of fact. "Once, I broke his expensive German lens over his head and left that night." A small smile played at her lips. "I'd been saving to open my own studio somewhere. When I saw the advertisement about the railroad coming through Montana territory and the opportunities for new businesses, it seemed like Providence." Isaac watched as she carefully lifted a glass negative from the chemical bath, her movements precise and confident. In that moment, he saw her clearly, not as the delicate Eastern girl he'd first assumed her to be, but as a woman of remarkable courage and determination. "You're extraordinary," he said softly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Hannah looked up, her face partially shadowed in the dark room's dim light. For a breathless moment, something electric passed between them. "You should get some sleep," she said finally, turning back to her work. "It's late." Isaac lay awake long into the night, listening to Hannah moving quietly around the studio and confronting the uncomfortable truth he'd been avoiding for months. He was falling in love with Hannah Kelsey. The realization terrified him more than any stampede or blizzard ever had. True to Isaac's prediction, Donovan didn't let the matter rest. Over the next few weeks, Hannah faced a series of unexplained problems: a broken window at her studio, rumors circulating about the impropriety of a young, unmarried woman photographing men, and finally, a small fire that started mysteriously behind her building one night. Isaac found himself spending more and more time in town, ostensibly checking on Hannah but increasingly unable to deny his growing feelings for her. They fell into a comfortable routine. He would help with repairs or heavy lifting at the studio, and she would often cook dinner for them afterward in her small rooms above the shop. One evening in late July, as they sat sharing a simple meal, Hannah suddenly asked, "Why haven't you married Isaac?" The question caught him off guard. They had gradually shifted to using first names, but their conversations had carefully avoided anything too personal since that night in the darkroom. "Never saw the point," he answered, focusing on his plate. "A ranch wife has a hard life, and I've never met anyone who'd make that hardship worthwhile." "Until now," Hannah asked softly. Isaac looked up, meeting her steady blue gaze. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken possibilities. Before he could answer, a commotion outside drew their attention. Isaac moved to the window and cursed under his breath. "It's Donovan and some of his men," he said, reaching for his gun belt. "They're drunk." "Isaac," Hannah began, but the sound of breaking glass downstairs interrupted her. "Stay here," Isaac ordered, heading for the stairs. He found Donovan and three of his ranch hands in the studio, smashing equipment and tearing photographs from the walls. "That's enough," Isaac said, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. Donovan turned, swaying slightly. "Well, if it ain't the gentleman rancher," he slurred, "defending your whore's honor again." The slur against Hannah ignited something dangerous in Isaac. "Get out," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now." "Or what?" Donovan sneered. "You'll shoot all four of us, even you ain't that fast, Vance." Isaac was calculating his odds when the sheriff appeared at the door, shotgun in hand. "Everything all right here, Miss Kelsey?" he called, his eyes never leaving the intruders. Hannah had come downstairs despite Isaac's warning. "These men were just leaving, Sheriff," she said calmly, "after they pay for the damage they've caused." Donovan glowered but threw some crumpled bills on the floor before stomping out, his men following. "This ain't over," he muttered as he passed Isaac. After the sheriff had taken statements and left, Hannah surveyed the wreckage of her studio with remarkable composure. "Most of the cameras are intact," she noted, examining a partially damaged tripod. "The plates in the darkroom weren't touched. I can reopen within a week." Isaac stared at her in disbelief. "Hannah, this can't continue." "Donovan won't stop. Next time could be worse." "What would you have me do?" she asked. "Close my business, leave town?" "That's exactly what he wants." "I want you safe," Isaac insisted. The evening's events had shaken him more than he cared to admit, bringing his worst fears to the surface. Caring for someone meant having something precious to lose, and tonight had shown him just how easily Hannah could be taken from him. "I've never felt unsafe with you nearby," she said quietly, reaching out to touch his arm. The simple gesture of trust undid him. Isaac pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. "I can't lose you," he whispered into her hair. Hannah leaned back to look up at him, her eyes bright with emotion. "Then don't push me away," she replied. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered in the midst of broken glass and scattered photographs. Their second was not. Later, as they sat amid the wreckage making plans to rebuild, Isaac made a decision. "Move out to the ranch," he said, "at least until things cool down with Donovan. You can still run the studio during the day, but you'd be safer at night away from town." Hannah considered the offer. "People will talk," she said, though she didn't sound particularly concerned. "Let them," Isaac replied. "You can have the main house, I'll take the cabin." She raised an eyebrow. "That seems unnecessary." "It's proper," he insisted, though the thought of Hannah living under his roof, separated only by propriety rather than miles, was enough to make his heart race. Hannah agreed to the arrangement, and within 2 days she had moved a trunk of essentials to the Double V, while maintaining her business hours at the studio in town. Summer flowed into early autumn, and with each passing day, Isaac found the walls he'd built around his heart crumbling further. Hannah's presence transformed the ranch, her sketches and photographs adorned walls that had been bare for years, and the sound of her laughter made the house feel truly like a home for the first time. They settled into a new routine, with Isaac driving Hannah to town each morning and picking her up each evening. Sometimes they ate dinner in town, other times they prepared meals together in his kitchen. Their evenings were spent in conversation or comfortable silence on the porch, watching the stars emerge over the mountains. It was during one such evening in late September that Isaac finally spoke the words that had been growing in his heart. "I love you," he said simply as Hannah sketched the sunset from her seat beside him. She looked up, her pencil pausing mid-stroke, and smiled, a smile so brilliant it rivaled the setting sun. "I know," she replied. "I've been waiting for you to realize it." Isaac laughed, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. "How long have you known?" "Since February," she said confidently. "You brought me a box of special developing chemicals from Helena. You'd remembered the exact specifications from a casual mention weeks earlier." "And you?" he asked, suddenly uncertain. "Do you?" "I've loved you since you stood in the snow for my photograph," she interrupted gently. Patient and slightly annoyed, but willing to indulge me anyway. Isaac pulled her into his arms, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, how natural it felt to hold her. "Marry me," he whispered against her hair. "Not because of Donovan or propriety or any other reason, except that I want to spend my life with you." Hannah tilted her face up to his, her eyes shining. "Yes," she said, "though I warn you I intend to keep working. The frontier needs photographers too." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Isaac assured her, sealing the promise with a kiss. Their engagement announcement was met with general approval throughout Paradise Valley, with the notable exception of Thomas Donovan. The man had been relatively quiet since the incident at the studio, but Isaac remained wary, increasing security around both the ranch and Hannah's business in town. As the wedding approached, scheduled for the first weekend in November, Isaac found himself happier than he'd ever believed possible. The falsehood that had governed his life for so long, that the frontier demanded isolation, had been thoroughly disproven by Hannah's love. 1 week before the wedding, the first winter storm of the season swept across the valley, dropping 8 inches of snow overnight. Isaac woke to find Hannah already outside, photographing the pristine landscape in the early morning light. "Couldn't this wait until after breakfast?" he called from the porch, smiling despite his grumbling. "The light is perfect right now," she replied, not looking up from her camera. "And fresh snow never lasts." Isaac was about to retreat to the warmth of the kitchen when he noticed a rider approaching from the direction of town. As the figure drew closer, he recognized Silas's eldest son, Thomas, urging his horse through the deep snow with unusual urgency. "What is it?" Isaac asked as the young man reined in before the house. "Fire in town," Thomas panted, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Miss Kelsey's studio. Sheriff sent me to fetch you both." Isaac felt his blood run cold. "How bad?" "Bad enough," Thomas replied grimly. "They're saying it was deliberate. Donovan was seen in town last night, drunk and making threats." Hannah had abandoned her camera and joined them, her face pale but composed. "Was anyone hurt?" "No, ma'am. Fire was discovered before it spread to other buildings." Isaac was already moving toward the barn. "Saddle the horses," he called over his shoulder. "We'll ride in together." The journey to town was made in tense silence, their horses struggling through the fresh snow. As they crested the final hill overlooking Livingston, Hannah gasped. Even from a distance, they could see the blackened skeleton of her studio, smoke still rising from the charred remains. A crowd had gathered around the burned building. As Isaac and Hannah dismounted, the sheriff approached, his expression grim. "I'm sorry, Miss Kelsey," he said. "We saved what we could, but the building's a total loss." "My equipment, the photographs?" Hannah asked, her voice steady despite the devastation before her. "Some were salvaged, Mrs. Peterson from the general store has them." He hesitated. "We found this by the back door." He held out a piece of paper with crude lettering. "Leave town or the next fire won't be so small." Isaac took the note, rage building inside him. "Where's Donovan now?" "That's the thing," the sheriff said, lowering his voice. "Nobody's seen him since last night. His foreman rode in this morning looking for him. Says Donovan never came home." As Hannah moved to inspect the ruins with the sheriff, Isaac remained where he was, studying the burned building with growing unease. Something about the fire didn't align with Donovan's usual tactics. The man was a bully and a drunkard, but this level of destruction seemed excessive even for him. While Hannah sorted through the recovered items, Isaac spoke with witnesses, trying to piece together the events of the previous night. What emerged was troubling. Several people had indeed seen Donovan drinking heavily at the saloon, making his usual threats against Hannah and Isaac. But he'd left well before midnight, while the fire hadn't been discovered until nearly 3 in the morning. As Isaac was pondering this discrepancy, a commotion at the edge of town drew everyone's attention. Donovan's foreman was riding in at a gallop. Another man slumped before him on the saddle. "Need the doctor," the foreman shouted. "Found him in the creek bed, half frozen." Isaac pushed through the gathering crowd to see Donovan himself, unconscious and bloodied, his clothes singed and torn. The doctor was summoned and Donovan was carried to his office. Isaac followed, determined to get answers. "What happened?" he demanded of the foreman. "Don't rightly know," the man replied, clearly shaken. "Found his horse wandering back to the ranch this morning, saddle empty. Tracked back and found him in the creek ravine, looked like he'd been thrown. But," he hesitated, "his clothes smell of coal oil, same as we use for lamps. And there's burns on his hands that don't match with a fall." Isaac's mind raced. If Donovan had been injured during or immediately after setting the fire, it changed everything. Instead of the villain in this story, he might be a victim, but of whom? The doctor emerged from examining Donovan. "He's conscious," he announced, "asking for the sheriff and for you, Vance." Inside the examination room, Donovan lay on a table, his face bruised and one arm bandaged. His eyes focused on Isaac as he entered. "Come to gloat," he rasped. "Come for the truth," Isaac replied evenly. "Did you set the fire?" Donovan closed his eyes briefly. "No," he said, "was heading there, I admit. Drunk enough to do something stupid, but someone jumped me before I got there, hit me from behind." He winced as he shifted position. "Woke up smell of smoke all over me, thrown in the creek like garbage." "Who would do that?" the sheriff asked skeptically. "The railroad men," Donovan replied, his voice strengthening. "Been trying to buy that building for months, prime location near the planned station. Miss Kelsey wouldn't sell." Isaac felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter day. The Northern Pacific representatives had indeed been aggressive about acquiring properties along the proposed route, but he'd never imagined they'd resort to violence. "You're saying someone attacked you, used your known grudge as cover, and burned down Hannah's studio to force her out," Isaac clarified. Donovan nodded weakly. "Ain't no saint, Vance, but I didn't do this. Man has a right to his name, even if it ain't worth much." Isaac believed him. Despite everything, he recognized the rough code of frontier honor in Donovan's eyes, the same code that wouldn't allow a man to deny his legitimate sins while being accused of another's crimes. Outside, Isaac relayed this information to the sheriff and Hannah, who had joined them at the doctor's office. "It makes a certain sense," the sheriff admitted reluctantly. "The railroad's been buying up land all along the proposed route. Miss Kelsey's studio sits right where they want to put the station house." Hannah's expression hardened. "They approached me last month with an offer well below market value. When I refused, their representative said I should reconsider before accidents happen in frontier towns." "You never told me that," Isaac said, disturbed by this revelation. "I didn't take it seriously," Hannah replied. "I should have." The sheriff stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "Hard to prove without witnesses. Railroad has powerful friends in the territorial government." "So they just get away with it?" Isaac demanded, anger rising in his throat. "Not necessarily," Hannah said, a determined gleam in her eye. "I still have my cameras, and I have an idea." Hannah's plan was bold, perhaps recklessly so. Using contacts she'd developed through her photography business, she arranged a meeting with the Northern Pacific representatives under the pretense of reconsidering their offer. Meanwhile, Isaac and the sheriff would gather evidence from railroad workers who might have knowledge of the arson plot. For the next 3 days they worked separately but toward the same goal. Hannah met with the railroad men, subtly pressing for information while appearing to negotiate. Isaac discovered that several new laborers had been hired just days before the fire and had mysteriously departed immediately afterward. On the fourth day, everything came to a head when Hannah managed to photograph one of the railroad representatives meeting secretly with a known arsonist from Helena. The evidence, combined with testimony from a railroad worker who'd overheard the plot, was enough for the sheriff to make arrests. The scandal rocked the small community. The territorial governor himself came to Livingston to assure residents that such tactics would not be tolerated, and the railroad adjusted its proposed route to avoid demolishing existing businesses. As for Hannah's studio, the community rallied around her. The Cattlemen's Association, led by Isaac, raised funds to rebuild, and by early December, construction was well underway on a new, larger building. Through it all, Isaac found himself marveling at Hannah's resilience and courage. Where he once might have seen these challenges as confirmation that the frontier was too harsh for happiness, he now recognized that adversity could strengthen bonds rather than break them. Their wedding, postponed by the events surrounding the fire, was finally held on Christmas Eve in the small church in Livingston. Hannah wore a dress of deep ivory silk that she'd ordered from back east, and Isaac found himself speechless at the sight of her walking down the aisle toward him, her honey-blonde hair adorned with winter berries and pine. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she whispered as she reached his side. "Just wondering how I got so lucky," he replied softly. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. As they exchanged vows, Isaac felt the last of his protective walls crumble completely. The belief that had defined him for so long, that caring made you vulnerable in a dangerous world, hadn't been wrong exactly, but it had been incomplete. Yes, loving Hannah made him vulnerable, but it also made him stronger than he'd ever been alone. As winter settled fully over Paradise Valley, the newlyweds established their life together on the Double V. Hannah continued her photography business from the newly rebuilt studio in town, dividing her time between there and the ranch. Isaac found that his fears of disruption to his carefully ordered life were unfounded. Hannah complemented rather than complicated his existence. One snowy evening in February, as they sat before the fire in their home, Hannah presented Isaac with a large, carefully wrapped package. "An early birthday present," she explained as he unwrapped it curiously. Inside was a framed photograph, the landscape shot she'd taken of him standing with his horse on that first day after the storm, the mountains rising majestically behind him. But mounted beside it was something even more remarkable. Her sketch from that snowy day when she'd first arrived in Montana, the drawing of his smile that had so unnerved him when he'd first seen it. "I wanted you to see what I saw," Hannah said softly, "even then." Isaac studied both images, the photograph capturing the exterior man, strong and capable against the wild Montana landscape. The sketch revealing something deeper, a gentleness and capacity for joy he'd forgotten existed within himself until Hannah had drawn it out. "You saw me before I remembered who I was," he said, drawing her into his arms. Hannah rested her head against his chest. "And you saw me when others only saw a woman who didn't belong." Outside, snow fell silently over the valley, covering the land in a fresh blanket of white. Within the warm circle of their home, Isaac and Hannah Vance held each other, secure in the knowledge that they had found in each other not just love, but a true partner for the frontier life they both had chosen. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Hannah's photography business grew to include commissions from as far away as San Francisco. And when their first child was born the following winter, a daughter with her mother's blue eyes and her father's quiet determination, Isaac finally understood the complete truth that had eluded him for so long. The frontier wasn't a place where love couldn't survive. It was a place where love was essential for survival. Each year when the first snow fell, Isaac would take out Hannah's old sketchbook and turn to that first drawing of himself, the moment when a young woman with an artist's eye had seen past his carefully constructed walls and captured the smile he thought he'd lost forever. It remained his favorite of all her works, more precious than any of the award-winning photographs that would later bring her national recognition. "You found me," he would often tell her in the quiet moments before sleep. And Hannah would always answer, "We found each other." In the harsh beauty of Montana territory, where so many came seeking fortune but found hardship instead, Isaac and Hannah Vance discovered something far more valuable, a love strong enough to weather any storm, and a home built not just of logs and labor, but of shared dreams and mutual trust. And that, they both agreed, was worth any price the frontier demanded.